Hello and welcome everyone, Tiberius here, and I recently gave an intro to lockpicking talk at the Red Society Club on Discord, where I went over the basics of locks and lockpicking and finished by picking a Master Lock 141D padlock using various techniques. Since my previous video on lockpicking did well, here's the full recording of that session. For context, participants bought the Covert Instruments Genesis set along with the aforementioned Master Lock 141D padlock to practice on. Links to both can be found in the video description. Most of the diagrams used in this talk were created by Deviant for Tool, the open organization of lockpickers, and you can also find them at the link on the screen and in the video description. As always, if you enjoy the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Without further ado, here's the recorded session. So, I'll have a quick disclaimer before we begin. So, I'm not a professional locksmith. I have absolutely no qualifications in lockpicking. I'm entirely self-taught using basically just resources online. And I'm by no means an expert. I basically just pick locks for fun. So I also can't pick every lock, and I still get stuck quite often, especially on sort of more advanced keyways. I think that's a general rule. Like we all watch Lockpicking Lawyer, and he picks everything in like 5 seconds, but we're not all like that, unfortunately. With that being said, there are 2 rules we have in the lockpicking or lock sport community. The first is that you never pick a lock if you don't have permission from the owner to pick it. That's not lock sport. That's known as breaking and entering. And the second one is you never pick a lock that someone relies on. Now, that second rule is kind of flexible. Lockpicking is a largely non-destructive technique. However, it's not without its risks. So you can damage locks by picking them, so that's just something you should be aware of. If you ever do find yourself locked out of your house, then you can by all means pick your door lock. But afterwards, just make sure it functions properly, which in this case means it locks and unlocks using the key. Alright, so when we talk about the different types of a lock, we're usually not talking about sort of padlocks versus door locks. We'd rather the actual locking mechanism. So you can often identify the type of locking mechanism by the keyway, which is quite useful. So for example, if we start from the left, we have a classic pin-tumbler lock. This is possibly the most popular locking mechanism in the world. The pins are cylindrical and they're located at the top of the keyway. You can actually see the first one right in there. And at the bottom of the keyway is empty so that the key can be inserted. In the UK, for whatever reason, that keyway is often installed upside down with the pins at the bottom. In this example, the keyway has a jagged shape that's known as warding. That type of keyway is called paracentric, and it's basically a security feature aimed at making picking the lock more difficult. However, many locks have straight keyways, and even in this case, with a thin enough pick, the warding will not hinder any lock picking efforts. The next lock is a wafer lock, which has a straight keyway with rectangular wafers instead of cylindrical pins. Keyway is usually quite wide without any warding, and wafer locks can either be single or double-sided, meaning they have wafers at both the top and bottom of the keyway, as in the photo here. You can just about see one there and the other one up here. So that means the key can be entered either way up, and wafer locks are commonly found on desk drawers or document safes, but unfortunately the vast majority of them can be opened easily with a set of jigglers, which operate exactly how the name implies. You put the jiggler into the keyway and you turn it while jiggling it around a lot. Tubular locks are technically a type of pin-tumbler lock, only the pins are arranged in a circle. You can see a few of the pins here. Tubular locks are often used on bicycle locks and elevators and vending machines. The last type is a dimple lock and is also a type of pin-tumbler lock. However, the pins are installed in the side of the keyway instead of the top. So you can see here, this is the pin and there's some warding here to basically align the key. Now, dimple locks are often considered a high security lock since picking them with standard tools is pretty difficult. However, with a good set of dimple picks, they are technically no more secure than a classic pin tumbler. Okay, we've got 4 more. Disc detainer locks use rotating discs with slots that must be aligned, which allows a sidebar to drop down, unlocking the lock. Like dimple locks, disc detainer locks are generally considered high security, mostly because you need special tools in order to pick them open. We have warded locks, which use hidden warding deep in the lock to prevent the incorrect keys from turning. This is also one of the oldest locking mechanisms dating back to ancient China and Rome. Unsurprisingly though, those locks are among the easiest to pick using a set of skeleton keys, which bypass the warding to reach the turning mechanism. It may surprise you to learn there are only about 5 different skeleton keys required to open almost every single warded lock. Lever locks use a series of levers which must be lifted to specific heights by the key as it turns, allowing the key to push a locking bolt out of place. This is a common door lock in Europe, Africa, and South America, and of course lever locks can be picked with the right equipment and don't pose much of a challenge. And finally, we have the lock that looks nothing like the others, though it shares some similarities with the disc detainer lock. The combination locks have no key, but instead use a series of rotating numbered discs that open when the correct combination is set. That means that one unique feature of combination locks compared to the others is the relative ease at which the key can be changed. Unfortunately, though, combination locks suffer from both bypass and decoding attacks. Okay, so for this workshop, we're going to be focusing on pin-tumbler locks, since they're the most common lock in the world, and most lockpicking sets are designed with them in mind. It's easy to understand the locking mechanism by reducing it into 2 dimensions. So here we have a cross-section of a pin-tumbler lock. The outer casing of the lock is known as the shell, or the cylinder. A vertical hole called the pin chamber is drilled from the top of the cylinder, and this area up here is known as the Bible. And please don't ask me why, I have no idea. The yellow section is the plug, which rotates within the cylinder, and itself contains the keyway and holes which align with the pin chambers in the cylinder. Although here it looks like the plug is 2 separate sections, in 3 dimensions it's all one piece of metal. So each pin chamber contains a spring at the top, followed by a driver pin shown in blue, and a key pin in red. If you want an easy way to remember that, the key pin is the one that touches the key. The spring pushes both the driver and key pin down to their resting positions, and in these positions, the driver pin should be partially in the cylinder, right, and partially in the plug. The point at which the cylinder, plug, and driver pin meet is called the shear line. So if we try to rotate the plug without a key, we can turn it a little bit, but we are blocked by the driver pin. And this is the very simple mechanism that keeps the lock locked, and it works relatively well. So what happens when the correct key is inserted is the key pin pushes the driver pin up above the shear line, but crucially it keeps the key pin below the shear line. So now with nothing blocking the shear line, the plug is free to turn and the lock opens. Here's a side view of the pin-tumbler lock with the front of the lock on the left. When describing the number of pins in a lock, we generally count the number of pin stacks, i.e. each pair of key and driver pins. That makes this a 5-pin lock. We also generally number the pins from the front of the lock, i.e. left to right in this case, starting with pin number 1. One thing to notice is that all the key pins are different lengths, meaning that they have to be pushed up different amounts for the driver pins to be pushed above the shear line. If this weren't the case, then you could simply insert a flat piece of metal and raise all the key pins simultaneously to open the lock. The length of each key pin determines the depth of each cut on the key, which is known as the bitting. So if you notice, the longest key pin, which is pin 2, has the lowest cut on the key, and the shortest key pin, pin 4, has the highest cut. So in this lock, all the driver pins are the same length. There are some interesting attacks against locks when this is the case, however they are pretty difficult to pull off, so that isn't that insecure. In high security locks, the pin stacks are quote-unquote balanced, with shorter driver pins for longer key pins and vice versa. And that generally means that the tops of the driver pins will all be aligned. So when a key is pushed into the lock, the key pins slide up and down the peaks, and once the correct key is fully inserted, the key pin sits in the corresponding valley of the key, and every driver pin is above the shear line, which allows the lock to open. Since a pin-tumbler lock requires all the pins to be properly aligned to open the lock, even if a key has a very similar bitting, it should not be able to open the lock. So in this example, the cut for pin 2 is too high, and the key pin has crossed the shear line and is preventing the key from turning the lock. In this example, the cut for pin 2 is too low, and the driver pin is still blocking the shear line. So interestingly, this means that overuse of the same key may actually lead to certain cuts wearing down and rendering the key useless. But practically this isn't a huge problem due to tolerances within the lock. However, it does mean if you really want to lock someone out of their house and you have access to their key, you can do it relatively easily if you just file down one of the cuts. I'm not saying you should do that, of course. That's probably very bad and illegal. Let's talk about the concept of binding pins, which is fundamental to picking pin-tumbler locks. So with all the pin stacks in their resting positions, if we were to rotate the plug, one of the driver pins is going to be pushed up against the shear line before the others. And we call this the binding pin because it's literally being held in place by the rotational forces being applied to the plug. So in a perfect world, all the pins would bind at once. On the left, you can see the key chambers in a perfect world's lock. They're all perfectly aligned. They're all identical in size. So when you rotate the plug, every single driver pin binds at once because every driver pin is identical too. However, luckily, we don't live in a perfect world, and in our world, it's practically impossible to make anything perfectly, let alone 5 times. The image on the left is exaggerated, but it highlights the problems we face. Even if we have amazingly precise machining tools, we will end up with imperfections in both the pin chamber sizes and the alignments, not to mention the pins themselves. So if we rotate the plug clockwise, the rightmost pin stack, looking at the lock straight on, will contact the shear line first. So it's easy to see that in this left image, and this would be the 4th pin stack here, and the animation shows this. If we rotate the plug clockwise until a driver pin is binding, we can then set that pin using a lockpick by simply pushing it up above the shear line. Note that the key pin will still move freely after its corresponding driver pin is set. We can usually tell when a binding pin has been set by an audible click that's made when the plug slips off the bottom of the pin, and by the tiny clockwise movement of the plug as it slides under the pin and binds the next rightmost driver pin against the shear line. So to pick a pin tumbler lock, we need 2 tools. The first is a turning tool, which is this thing here. It's also called a tension wrench. It provides a rotational force on the plug. We then need a lockpick to move down the keyway and lift key pins to both find and set binding driver pins. So in the animation, the turning tool is positioned in the bottom of the keyway. A clockwise turning force is applied. The lockpick lifts each of the key pins in turn. If there's no resistance or the key pin feels a bit springy, we're likely not at a binding pin. But once we encounter a key pin which is difficult to lift, we are likely at a binding pin, and we just continue to lift it until we hear that telltale click and feel the plug turn a little, indicating the driver pin is now set. We then repeat the process until we've located and set all driver pins. Providing everything worked out, this should result in all driver pins being above the shear line with all key pins below it, allowing the plug to move freely and unlocking the lock. This method is called single pin picking, or SPP, because we pick a single pin at a time. So one of the most common mistakes you can make when picking is overlifting or oversetting pins. This is where you lift the binding driver pin above the shear line, but also manage to lift the key pin above the shear line too, effectively making it a new binding pin. This can happen for multiple reasons. If you're picking too quickly, it's easy to push the pin up above the shear line before the plug turns properly. If the lock has high tolerances, the plug may not turn much when a pin is set, allowing you to accidentally push the key pin too high. And if the keyway is small, the shaft of your pick may lift pins at the front of the lock while you're trying to test pins at the back of the lock. We can try to avoid oversetting pins by slowing down, making sure that we lift pins slowly, and try to pivot our lockpick off the bottom of the keyway, i.e. off the turning tool, rather than lifting it entirely. Sometimes increasing the tension in your turning tool can also help when the lock has high tolerances. If you do think you've overset a pin, there's unfortunately really only one remedy, which is to release your tension very slightly until you hear the overset pin drop back down. Sometimes this release in tension will result in all set pins dropping down, and you'll have to start all over again. This is generally a good lesson for beginners because often it's much quicker just to give up and release all tension starting again from scratch than it is to continue fighting overset pins. We'll briefly talk about security pins, but as beginner pickers, you don't need to concern yourself with them. Though plenty of locks don't contain any security pins, and those are the ones that you should really be practicing on until you feel confident enough to advance. Security pins make picking a lock harder, but not impossible. They are modified driver pins with a shape that causes the pin to feel set when it's actually not. So the security pin on the right is called a spool pin. The thinner midsection basically causes the plug to rotate slightly when the pin is not set, but that basically makes it feel like a set pin. Okay, so let's talk briefly about some different turning tools. Turning tools come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. As a rule, you want to choose a turning tool that is snug within the keyway, so it doesn't move around too much and provides a nice turning force. However, the shape of the tool can also have advantages and disadvantages depending on the situation. By far the most common shape is the L wrench, sometimes called a wiper blade insert, as it can be easily made from a windshield wiper blade. It's basically a thin flat piece of metal with a small bend so it looks like the letter L. The variant on the right has a half twist in the handle for comfort, however I'll explain in a moment why that's generally a bad idea. To use the L wrench, you insert the smaller end into the bottom of the keyway, with the handle usually pointing out to the right so that a downward force will translate to a clockwise rotation of the plug. Note that your fingers will be pushing down on the thinner edge of the turning tool, which is why the half twist variant exists. However, your turning tool is one of the primary methods of feedback you get from a lock while picking it. So while the half twist offers more comfort, it also introduces springiness to the turning tool, which reduces feedback. I recommend if you are hurting your fingers while lockpicking, you either adjust your technique or use some kind of sports tape rather than using a subpar turning tool. The Z-bar, or I guess S-bar, depending on your perspective, is a double-ended L wrench, with the added bonus that one of the ends is usually shorter or a slightly different shape, meaning you basically get two turning tools in one. Other than that, the Z-bar is basically used the same way as an L wrench. So the L wrench and Z-bar are both bottom of the keyway or BOK turning tools, since they are inserted at the very bottom of the keyway. There are several wrenches designed to fit at the very top of the keyway, and those are unsurprisingly called TOC wrenches. The TOC wrenches often have a serrated notch at the end, and they come in varying depths and widths. The set on the left uses more traditional TOC profiles, while the set on the right are a relatively new invention dubbed ergo turners, since they're more ergonomic, and in my opinion they're far easier to use. So TOC wrenches share almost nothing in common with BOK wrenches. So with BOK, you slide the tool as far into the keyway as possible, since the bottom of the keyway is basically empty space. At the top of the keyway, approximately 1/10 of an inch into most locks, you'll find the first key pin. Sometimes you might have a little more room to play with, sometimes less. However, when using TOC tools, you only insert the tool as far as the start of the first pin. It might surprise you, it's still very possible to put a good amount of tension on the lock when the tool has hardly any purchase. This is partially because the serrations mentioned earlier help grip the top of the keyway, but also because while using TOC tension, you always choose a tool with the snuggest fit. Provided your tool is thick enough and you've positioned it correctly, you should be able to apply rotational force without the tool falling out. TOC tension does require a lot of practice to master, however, and sometimes the sudden turning of the lock when it is opened will cause the tool to spring out, which is honestly just more annoying than anything. Despite all the disadvantages, TOC tensioning is the preferred tensioning method for most experienced lockpickers for pretty much one big reason: it doesn't get in the way of your pick. So with BOK tools, your pick is always elevated in the lock because it's resting on the turning tool. In low security locks, that's fine since the keyway is open and you still have enough room to move your pick. However, in many locks, a BOK tool will simply take up too much of the keyway and your pick will start oversetting pins. With your turning tool at the top of the keyway, your pick can rest against the very bottom, easily moving along the length of the lock and only picking the pins you want to pick. So once you've decided on which turning tool to use, the inevitable question that gets asked is how much tension do I need? And there are generally two schools of thought: a little and a lot. Both are actually fine because ultimately the key to tensioning is understanding that it's pretty variable. There's no right amount of tension generally, rather each lock has an ideal amount. Finding that amount depends on your approach, so if you start off with a little tension and no pins are binding, just increase the tension until one does. Meanwhile, if you start off with a lot of tension and you can't lift the binding pin, decrease it until you can. These days I tend to start off with a little amount of tension just because it's less effort in general, but that can also result in set pins dropping back down if you're not careful. It can also be easier to overset pins. However, with a lot of tension, you can sometimes bend your picks trying to lift a binding pin. You may be wondering which direction you should turn your turning tool in, clockwise or counterclockwise. The correct answer is whichever way the key turns. That isn't helpful if you don't have the key. So the more practical but still kind of unhelpful answer is, unfortunately, it depends. For most padlocks, clockwise is pretty standard. For door locks, often the opposite is true. However, there are some models that do use a clockwise direction. Furthermore, if the lock is attached to a deadbolt latch, the turning direction is usually just away from the door frame, since doors can either be left-handed or right-handed opening. Alright, so let's quickly talk about how to hold a lockpick. There are several good ways to hold a lockpick, but there are far more bad ways. So this is going to be less me telling you to hold it a specific way and more me telling you the do's and the don'ts. This advice is purely for single pin picking techniques. We'll cover some raking, zipping, and comb picking shortly, and for those techniques, how you hold your pick isn't really a big part of the technique. So the image on screen is how I hold my lockpicks. I've highlighted the 3 areas I think are the most important. The first is having a finger near the end of the pick. It should be resting against the pick and also be in contact with the lock at all times. While picking, you'll slide the pick along this finger as you go in and out of the lock. This finger provides stabilization, which increases your precision, and when you're dealing with a small keyway, precision is everything. So for me, this is just generally my ring finger. The next is where I grip my pick, and usually I do this at the point where the shaft meets the handle, holding it between my middle finger and thumb. And finally, we need a way to apply a pivoting force to the pick, which is where my forefinger comes in, positioning it further along and on top of the handle. So you'll have to adapt that to several different handle designs, and obviously comfort's also important, but for me, this seems to work out nicely. You'll notice the pick I'm using here is part of the Genesis set from Covert Instruments, which is the one I recommended for this workshop. But yeah, it honestly just depends on the handle and what you feel most comfortable with. So here's an example where I'm picking a lock using bottom of the keyway tension, with my pick resting on and using the tensioning tool as a pivot point. My ring finger is providing that stability I talked about, and my forefinger is providing the downward force to actually pivot. It should be no surprise to hear there are different types of lockpick, and if you bought the recommended Genesis set from Covert Instruments, you should have about 2 each of 2 types of lockpick. When considering different types of lockpick, there are generally 2 attributes that are the most important. That's the thickness or the width of the pick, and then the profile of the pick. Other less important attributes include the type of metal being used and the shape of the handle. So lockpicks come in a variety of thicknesses that's usually measured in thousandths of an inch. The thicker a lockpick, the stronger it will generally be. However, that also decreases maneuverability inside of narrower keyways. In the US, luckily, keyways tend to be wider than their European counterparts, so in most cases we can use thicker picks with no real issues. Once you do get into the hobby, you'll probably find yourself wanting to use thinner picks, so you can end up picking more locks. There's no real industry standard thickness for picks, however 25 thousandths of an inch is really as thick as you should go. As a side note, if you ever find yourself considering buying a cheap Chinese set off Amazon or AliExpress, just be aware the picks will likely be more than 30 thousandths of an inch thick. I have a whole video on YouTube about cheap sets and why you should generally avoid them. The default thickness for Covert Instruments picks is 25 thousandths, however they also sell some variants in 20 thousandths. My general favorite picks, which are Jimmy Longs, come in 23 thousandths and 19 thousandths. I think actually they've just released some 18 thousandths as well. The thinnest picks I've actually seen are 12 thousandths of an inch, and those tend to be extremely flexible, but they still are useful. Okay, the most common pick profile for single pin picking is the hook. It's designed to lift a single pin at a time, and it comes in various depths. The very tip of the pick can either be flat or rounded, which is usually a personal preference. Flatter hooks tend to be easier to use for beginners, but can also catch more easily on other pins. Hence, the rounded variant is often preferred by more experienced pickers. For most beginners, a short or medium hook is going to be fine. The reason you might want something with more depth, like the Gonzo or the deep hook, is if you're dealing with either high keyways and don't want to pivot as much, or if you have a zero cut pin near the back of the lock, which is basically a pin that needs to be lifted very, very high to be set. With a shorter hook, if you try to lift a pin too much, the rest of the shaft may come into contact with other pins, so basically this area here, and that could also overset them. Half diamonds are a pick that you'll either love or hate. The general idea is that you start with your pick fully inserted, then slowly move it back, and pins will automatically be lifted by the half diamond shape until you find a binding pin, at which point you can pivot and lift the pick until it's set. My problem with them is the peak of the diamond tends not to be very controllable when it comes to actual lifting, and the half diamond shape in general is pretty bulky, meaning you may contact other pins by accident. But having said that, some people swear by them. The point of offset picks is to give some extra room for particularly tricky keyways. So by offsetting the pick tip with either a gradual curve or a sudden angle up, we can pick pins at the very back of a keyway without interfering with any pin stacks before it. Note, these aren't always required for tricky keyways, and deep hooks can sometimes be used instead if an offset pick isn't in your kit. Rakes come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and it would honestly take too long to go over each profile here, so these are basically a kind of standard selection. Rakes aren't used for single pin picking, but rather for low skilled attacks like raking, zipping, rocking, also called lifting, and jiggling. The general idea behind rakes is to add random motion to set pins. Some rakes, like the snake rake, have very small profiles, while others like the quad peak or Bogota are large and varied. The batarang and wedge rakes are usually used for zipping attacks, while the city rake is designed for lifting. Again, there are variations on all of these. For example, in my kit I have about 5 different city rakes, all with similar looking but ultimately different profiles. The final type of pick we'll talk about are comb picks, named for obvious reasons, I hope. Whether comb picks count as picks is kind of debatable. They function more as bypass tools and do not work against all locks. They exploit a vulnerability where there is enough room above the keyway to accommodate the spring and both the driver and key pins, meaning that all parts of a locking mechanism can be lifted above the shear line. So for this reason, the correct comb pin for a lock is the one with the same number of prongs as there are pins in the lock. So we've talked about single pin picking, but let's also cover some of the other techniques. So this is a raking attack. It uses a back and forth motion, which combined with the peaks and valleys of the pick profile, raises and lowers the pins in the lock randomly until they're all set. You can also do it at an angle, as the second image shows. Raking generally only works against locks that use standard pins and not security pins. So this animation shows how a raking attack can work. So you push the rake in and you're moving it basically back and forth and very quickly setting the binding pins. Zipping is the technique where you insert your pick all the way into the keyway and then just quickly pull it out. You repeat that process until all pins are set. The wedge rake is ideal for this as it uses increasingly higher peaks. However, it's also possible to use other rake profiles and sometimes even a hook pick. A rocking or lifting attack is similar to raking, though instead of a back and forth motion, you just rock the pin up and down in the lock. And you can think of jiggling as a combination of raking and lifting, where the pick goes back and forth in the keyway, but you also rock it up and down, i.e. you just jiggle it. And finally, this diagram shows how comb picking works. So no turning tool is actually required for comb picking, as the comb pick is used to turn the plug itself. As you can see, all the pins have been lifted above the shear line, meaning there is nothing stopping the lock from turning. So it's important to note that not all locks are vulnerable to this attack, though it's often surprising which ones are. This attack, though, is easily defeated by reducing the amount of space in the pin chamber or just by using longer springs. Alright, so let's talk about the Master Lock 141D, which is the lock that I recommended for this workshop. It's described by Master Lock as having 4 pins for added pick resistance, which makes absolutely no sense. But I recommend this lock for beginner pickers because it's fully metal, which tends to be more structurally solid than plastic locks. It also has no security pins, and it's vulnerable to every single type of attack that I've gone over, including comb picking. And finally, on the screen are some resources. So the /r/lockpicking subreddit is really good for basically any kind of lockpicking resource. They also have the Belt Explorer web application. So the Reddit has this belt system where you can pick locks of varying different difficulties and get awarded belts based on which locks you pick. But the Belt Explorer is really nice because you can go there and basically pick white belt or yellow belt and see a bunch of different locks that basically lockpickers have said, yeah, these should be easy for beginners to open. So that's a really good resource. You also have more official organizations like Tool, which is the open organization of lockpickers, and also Lockpick Extreme, which is basically sort of a group that used to be part of Tool but no longer is. Those are generally the 2 groups you find at most security conferences running the Lockpick Village. LockWiki is another great project, so it's kind of similar to the Belt Explorer in a way. It does have a lot of pages dedicated to different types of lock, but it also has explanations of different techniques. We also have quite a few YouTubers. I can't list them all, but these are pretty much the top 4. So obviously Lockpicking Lawyer, McNally Official, who he works at Covert Instruments with Lockpicking Lawyer. Locknoob is a UK-based picker, so he has a lot of more European sort of style content. Bosnian Bill is retired now and doesn't upload to YouTube, but his entire catalog is still on there and is definitely worth looking at. And then you have sort of the recommended gear. So Covert Instruments, again, it's owned by Lockpicking Lawyer, but his stuff tends to be pretty quality. Jimmy Longs is an independent lockpick manufacturer, which he makes honestly the best, but unfortunately, because he's independent, a lot of his stuff is sold out all the time. So you kind of have to be lucky. He released 2 new sets last week and they were sold out within an hour. You also have Sparrows, which I believe is a Canadian company, and Southord. I would generally avoid Peterson. They were very recommended for lockpicking tools several years ago. However, they're extremely expensive. So like a standard lockpick will cost about $9 per pick. All right, so hopefully this will work. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to switch over to the other microphone over here. So that's the microphone in this webcam, but it's going to be much easier to demo and hear basically the lockpicking going on. So this is the Covert Instruments Genesis set that hopefully some of you got. So it comes with 3 turning tools. These are technically hybrid turning tools. So they are bottom of the keyway, but you can also kind of use them in the top of the keyway. So it's kind of tricky. I'll show that in a minute, but yeah, they technically are both. And then you have the 2 different types of pick. So you have a short hook here, this one, and then you have a medium hook. And then 2 different types of rake. So you have a 4-peak and a 5-peak rake. All right, so generally speaking with this lock, we're probably going to use a medium width. So on these, you'll be able to see maybe, if I take it up, you see the width there. Oh, there you go. So that's 40,000ths of an inch thick, which I think fits in this nicely. So the first attack we'll do, obviously this is definitely locked. The first attack we'll do is a simple zipping attack, and we'll use the short hook. And what we're going to do here is put it all the way in. I'm going to apply honestly, not much tension, not much turning force at all, just enough to sort of basically bind the keyway. We put the pick all the way in, and then we're just going to pull it out. And you might take a few attempts. Hang on, where's that? There we go. Hang on. So there we go. And it opens. It's honestly that simple. So again, we'll do it very, very small amount of turning force. You don't want it to be too high. You just want it to basically go in and behind the last. Just make sure it's behind the last pin. And then honestly just, there you go, opened again. Just pull it straight out. So that's a zipping technique. Now we'll use the 5-peak to do a raking attack. And so all we're doing now is, again, the same amount of tension, and we're just going to basically just, there we go. So again, very, very simple. In and out of the lock. And actually that opened immediately, so hang on. This lock is really bad. Like, yeah, you can sometimes just open it by pushing the rake in once, but sometimes if you just jiggle it enough, it'll open. All right, the other attack we can do is the comb pick. So this is one of my comb picks, as you can see here. And this doesn't require a tensioning tool. All we're going to do is put it into the lock. I'm going to align it with so each of these prongs is aligned with one of the pins. And then I'm going to just lift it up. So I'm going to align it and I'm going to twist. So we'll do that again. I push it in, align it, push it all the way up and twist. And that's basically just shoving all of the key pins and driver pins into the top of the Bible. Okay, and finally, we can actually do single pin picking. So again, I'm going to put bottom of the keyway tension in here. I'm going to use, hopefully if it zoomed, there we go. So I'm going to use the standard short hook. And realistically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rest it on my turning tool, feel for the first pin. So the first pin isn't binding. You should hopefully be able to hear some clicks. Okay, there's a click off number 3. Short click off number 4. So now we go back to the start. Okay, number 1's not binding. Number 2 is fine. So I think, yep, number 1, and rotate, and it opens. So obviously single pin picking is the hardest, but it's also the most reliable in terms of almost every single lock can be single pin picked. All right, whereas not every lock can be raked, even ones with no security pins. Sometimes it's just a bit difficult. So go in, pick number 3. Okay, go back. Oh, yep. So I must have accidentally set number 2 while just dragging the pick out. Sometimes that happens. But yeah. So what I recommend is you just try a few of the techniques. Try obviously zipping and raking first. Get a feel for how much tension you really want to put into the lock. And then if you feel confident you get those locks open, then you can try single pin picking. And don't be afraid, I've probably overset something here, so honestly do not be afraid to just release all the tension and start again. It's a lot easier than just trying to fight with a lock that's been with pins that have been overset. There we go. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more lockpicking content, please leave a comment on this video. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you next time.